Thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you very much to Shamel and to Rob and for everyone at the GDI, including everyone who is joining this lecture for this opportunity. It's a huge honor for me and a great opportunity to share ideas with such an esteemed institution, and I'm extremely grateful for this opportunity. Please, just while I'm just going to get my presentation up. But I just want to emphasize that I would really like this to be an exchange of ideas. We, with this report, have gone into areas which perhaps the OECD, where I work, as you might be able to guess from my background, doesn't usually go. And as Antonio said, we've also crossed sort of a range of different areas within social sciences. And inevitably, in doing so, we've sort of gone out on a limb in certain areas, and therefore, one of the points I'd like to stress before I start, this really is intended to provoke conversations. It's not meant to be the be-all and end-all of discontent. So, please just have that in mind as we go through today. So, as Antonio said, this report is part of the Perspectives on Global Development series, which has been running for about a decade, since 2010. And this one is called Perspectives on Global Development from Protest to Progress, which hopefully gives you some kind of sense of what we were trying to achieve with the report. And there it is on your side. And there's also what is just a wonderful photograph of the unrest in Chile in 2019. And it's something we'll come back to later in this lecture. So the purpose of the report is to examine the causes and consequences of discontent and what can be done to alleviate it. Now, as Antonio says, it's a big report, and I'm going to focus more on the diagnosis than the response. I think this is where I'm on. Well, I think part of the message about the response is that it has to be, there is no particular, there's no clear answer to what has to be done. Responses have to evolve. However, on the diagnosis, I think I'm on slightly surer footing by providing you with evidence and also to propose a framework to you. The report was prompted by a surge in political instability since the global financial crisis, probably starting with the Arab Spring, which certainly attracted the Development Centre's attention, because Tunisia was a country which had such strong or stable, at least, macroeconomic fundamentals, but suddenly there was this explosion of unrest which spread very quickly across the region, and arguably was one of the motivating factors behind the Occupy Wall Street protests, and then what has really continued to be, and I'll show you in a second what it looks like, a sort of a rise in political instability. And this actually continued in 2020 and in 2021, where we assumed, while putting the report together, that this surge that we saw in 2019, there were protests simultaneously across almost every Latin American country, for example. We assumed that this would in 2020 due to the COVID pandemic, but actually what happened is that the number of demonstrations still rose in that year, despite the fact that for 3 or 4 months, or longer in some cases, people were largely confined to their homes. And of course, it has continued in 2021 with some dramatic events at the start of the year in the United States and really continuing across the year. But what we aren't necessarily just looking at this kind of political instability, or rather, we wanted to look beyond it to a phenomenon that was perhaps both more easier to generalize, but perhaps harder to grasp. And so we hit on the idea of discontent, which we defined as a sort of collective frustration emerging from feelings of vulnerability, injustice, and unmet expectations. So it's already, we're starting from a term that is it's not immediately obvious to people what discontent means, but it was a way in which we could sort of enter this topic and address the kind of themes we wanted to. But your thoughts on this topic, on this choice, would be most welcome. We saw evidence of this discontent in advanced and developing economies alike over the last decade. Of course, I've already mentioned the protests, the Arab Spring, the protests in Latin America, and in other parts of the developing world, there have been sort of large-scale protests over the past decade, continuing today. But at the same time, actually, when we started writing this, the real issue was populism in Western countries and sort of the emergence of ethno-nationalist parties and really a sort of perceived crisis in liberal democracy, which is obviously continuing to this day. So while we are predominantly thinking about developing countries here, we're also, a lot of the evidence in the report, a lot of the thinking comes from advanced economies as well. What we also posit is that the causes of discontent go beyond economic and material concerns. Discontent is a psychological and a sociological phenomenon with strong political dimensions, both national and also international. So we sort of barge into the realm of international relations, political science, sociology, psychology, anthropology. And as I said, we don't necessarily have legitimacy in any or all of these spheres, but we wanted to sort of convey how complex this phenomenon is. But also, I think increasingly it's appreciated in academia, in organizations where we work as well, that multidimensional approaches and multidisciplinary approaches are increasingly key to understanding the complex challenges we confront. This report or this presentation today isn't going to be so much on COVID-19. It's somewhat retrospective, but COVID-19 was very much in our minds when we were writing it. And what the report tries to do is to explain how the how of building back better. So a lot of people have recognized that building back better means environmentally friendly policies. It means addressing inequality. It means various different policies, but beneath these are extremely complex political economy challenges, as Antonio mentioned. And really, we thought that by understanding discontent and helping policymakers perhaps to address it, this would enhance the chances of these changes actually taking hold and being effective. So, as I say, today's presentation is going to be based around a series of key propositions or ideas. I don't necessarily expect you to buy them all, but I'm very interested to discuss them, and I think these inform the report as a whole. So we argue that discontent has common causes and characteristics in different settings, and that it is thus possible to apply a general framework for understanding discontent, but not necessarily predicting it. That's, I think, a work for, well, the very complexity militates against any kind of prediction of what form discontent might take, when it might occur, and why, what might be the spark for it. We also argue that subjective well-being and social cohesion matter much more than we think. By we, I really mean typical discussions around development and economic policy, perhaps more broadly. We also think that discontent demands a rethink, not only about the journey, but also the destination of development. So our story starts around 1990, which is the sort of the high water, the end of the Cold War, the victory of liberal democracy as the model to export globally as a means of ensuring global stability and peace, but also the emergence of sort of market, perhaps not market fundamentalism as we have today, but certainly belief in the importance of the value of markets as a key driver of development. We also argue that in developing countries, the sources of discontent correspond to traps, which is the Development Centre, what we call these kind of structural bottlenecks to inclusive and sustainable growth. We also argue, and I won't really touch on this today because it opens a whole new area, but the international dimensions of discontent are extensive and demand a rethink of global institutions. And finally, and this is a point I'll try and convey today, but I think is not necessarily easy in the time available. But I think one of the things that defines discontent in this era, and makes it such a concern is that societies are finding it difficult to address the cause of discontent because the basis for collective action is absent, and because it's increasingly clear we don't even agree on the nature of a problem, much less how to deal with it. And I'll come back to that point later. So first of all, allow me to make the case for discontent. And this is based on the kind of Albert Hirschman model of exit and voice, which are your two options. If you're unhappy with the situation, either you leave or you express your voice and try and create change. And loyalty, which captures people's commitment to a particular cause or a particular system, and that'll influence their decision whether or not to leave or whether or not to express their voice. And this, works for consumers, but it also works for countries. So it's a very neat model. And so for voice, obviously, there's protests are the most obvious form of it, people taking to the streets and exercising their democratic right. So important to note that we don't necessarily see protests as anything abnormal. They're part of the legitimate tool in a functioning democracy. And so there's no insinuation, there's no attempt to stigmatize protest, but nonetheless, we do see protests having a certain weight, a certain importance, and being indicative of a certain level of dissatisfaction, perhaps, with other democratic processes. And so what we see is quite a sharp rise in number of protests globally from the global financial crisis onwards. And of course, it's a bit choppy, but there's a clear peak in 2015. And in all cases, there's been across all regions, there's been a sort of a noticeable trend upwards. But protests in and of themselves are an extremely well-studied field, and there's also different types of protests. So a very obvious distinction is the distinction between violent and non-violent protests. They are a different strategy. They're attempting to perhaps achieve a different result from the government, and they certainly pose the government with a different challenge. And just to give you a sense of how these trends might have changed in different regions. So here you have Africa and Asia Pacific. In Africa, you see on the left-hand side this sharp rise in protests over the last 30 years or so. But what you also see is an increasing number of protests being non-violent, or a higher proportion rather being non-violent than violent. Over this same period, there's been a shift away from political protest towards economic protest rather. So you see the nature of the protest is changing, and the conversation with the government is changing. And in some cases, that's a sign of a maturing of democracies in Africa. In Asia Pacific, on the other hand, there perhaps hasn't been such a sharp increase, but what there has been is, there hasn't necessarily been this switch towards more peaceful forms of protest. The proportion of violent protests has increased. But as a footnote to that, actually Africa is the one region in 2020 where violent protests increased, violent political protests, and also the number of fatalities in these protests was also up, unlike any other place in the world. So that suggests perhaps a worrying reversal in Africa. Now, we've had voice. The other approach is, as I say, exit. So this is when you perhaps feel so disenchanted or disaffected with the political system that you simply, you step back, you don't vote. You decide that none of the parties offer you anything. You refuse really to exercise the basic democratic responsibility of casting your ballot. And we see there's this kind of long-term decline in elections or voter turnout rather across all regions, which is accelerated over the course of the 1980s. And it's not and continued to decline in the 2000s. It's not really a great advert for the third wave of democracy. And then we have loyalty. So loyalty suggests that that changes the calculus. To what extent are people going to protest, or are they going to opt out of the political system? Or maybe they'll just they have confidence in the government, so they'll see how this plays out. And what is very worrying in many parts of the world, most parts of the world indeed, apart from in Asia, is that there's been a sharp decline in confidence in the government in the last 10 years or so, 10 years between 2006 and 2018. Now, because this is post-COVID, who knows how, these figures almost certainly will have changed, but I don't think we can necessarily be sure they'll have changed for the better. And there is certainly this reduction in trust and in confidence in governments in many parts of the world. And then if we look at from a different time frame, or a different level rather, here's the system as a whole, confidence in democracy. And in Africa, we see confidence in democracy has stayed more or less constant, whereas in Latin America, there's been a 10-point, there was a 10-point decline in confidence in democracy across the last 25 years or so, and as a result of which, barely half of the population on average across Latin America believes that you're better off. Democracy is the best system that's out there, which is quite a dramatic decline. Okay, so that's a very quick tour of our making the case for discontent, these downward trajectories on a number of indicators. Now I'm going to propose our framework for examining it. It's not mind-blowingly complicated by any stretch, but one thing that we were keen to avoid is this kind of, because let's be honest, this is everyone has a theory as to why their country has gone wrong or why people are unhappy. There's a lot out there, and a lot of it sort of falls into the trap of post hoc ergo propter hoc. There is inequality, therefore that must be the cause of discontent, or there is, everyone has their pet theory, and it's very, very hard to really sort of make that link clear. Why does inequality, for example, lead to discontent? And it's not to say it doesn't, but I think it behoves us as social scientists to try and understand these kind of relationships much better than perhaps is the case. And so our framework is, as I say, not very complicated. It separates three different factors. So you have the spark, which is the immediate cause of visible discontent. And then you have outside that the grievances, which is the sort of the immediate context. This is the fuel, if you will, for discontent related to day-to-day struggles and injustices. And often these are kind of materially based. And then within these grievances in turn have to be understood within, in terms of the sort of the structural factors that are fundamental, how society is organized, imbalances in how power and resources are shared, like these huge questions around the social contract and the relationship citizens have with themselves, the inclusiveness of the economy. These are huge questions, and but they also are, and they're very historical. They're infinite. But if you don't try and understand these more structural factors, then any attempt to understand the discontent of the day, or even how a particular protest came about, is always going to be somewhat limited. And so, to give you, the sort of the paradigm, or I'm not sure, I never know the right word for this, but the sort of the perfect example of our framework, it's almost too perfect, was provided by the unrest in Chile in October 2019. So, as I'm sure you know, the protest started because of a very small increase in metro fares. This increase irritated a great deal the people who used the metro, who started sort of invaded metro stations, jumped on trains, didn't pay their fares. The police were very heavy-handed. The violence flared and it spread outside the capital of Santiago, nationwide, and very quickly the protests were about a lot more than the price of metro fares. one of the things that people were unhappy about was the low value of pensions and the low minimum wage, but especially pensions which are privately run in Chile and have been delivering a very low retirement income for people for generations, even though the Chilean model is sort of hailed as or for a while was hailed as the shining light of pension reform in the 1990s. So was the question, so here I'm asking whether the cause of the El Estallido, it was called, the explosion in Chile, was it the increase in metro fares, or was it the low value of pensions? Or was it the poor quality of public services? So, education and health people are very unsatisfied with the quality of those, and also other public services as well. So high in cost, low in quality. Or the fourth option is the Pinochet era constitution. So it was agreed in 1980 while Pinochet was still in charge, and then in 1990 it sort of took effect. And what it did was that constitution sort of set in, even after Pinochet left, it made sure that his economic model, but also his government's vision for society more broadly, which was extremely sort of market-driven, neoliberal. It kept it in place. It was very difficult for successive governments to change very much. And so, I mean, you can't. This banner is absolutely perfect at the protest. It's not about 30 pesos, which was the increase in metro fares. It's about 30 years. This long-held injustice that was enshrined, codified by the Pinochet-era constitution. And so the answer to the question is, well, all of these were factors behind this explosion, this outburst in violence. But the only way in which Chile could really move forward was by fixing the constitution. So, a referendum was held, the population voted overwhelmingly for a new constitution. And then this year, voters were again asked who they would like to write this constitution. And what was fascinating is that they, by and large, voted for political outsiders. No one or only a very small proportion of members of this constituent assembly will come from the mainstream parties, whether they be left or center or right wing. This was a wholesale rejection of a political system, of an economic system, almost of a social system. So this is what we're trying to convey through this framework of understanding these kind of structural, and then the grievances, and then the spark, and how the fix often bears absolutely no relation to the spark itself. And for the record, the president did try and said, okay, we won't raise the cost of the metro and we'll improve pensions, but that wasn't nearly enough. Okay, so these grievances, I'll move quickly through these because they're fairly obvious, But a point I think to start from is that to understand the facts behind discontent, instead of assuming one thing or another, or looking at slow GDP growth or high levels of unemployment, low wage growth, all of these are important, but it's very helpful just to listen to people. And so we looked a lot at regional opinion surveys, Latino Barometer, the African Barometer. There's some very good surveys in Gallup, of course. And what we saw was that economic concerns are typically top of people's worries. So, for example, only 12% of Latin Americans considered the economic situation in their country to be good or very good in 2018. That's down from 25% in 2013. And this is pre-COVID. So one can only imagine how they view their situation now. Equally, 65% of African respondents in 2019-20, again, prior to COVID, felt their country was going in the right direction versus going in the wrong direction, followed by versus 50% in 2011, 2013. So there was this big increase in Africa of people who thought their country is just not going the right way. But it's not just about economics. People we see want better public services, greater security, better governance, as well as more voice in the way their country is run. And we can, it goes without saying that COVID-19 has exacerbated these grievances. So when I say, the subjective indicators are key, this chart, this is from Gallup, tells such a compelling story. So this is the proportion of people living comfortably or getting by. So this is, if you think about the people who don't counter this, these are people who everyone else isn't getting by, is effectively poor, impoverished, isn't making ends meet on a daily basis. And we can imagine the stress that's associated with that. So there are two things to notice. For example, the extremely low level in sub-Saharan Africa. That means that less than 40% of people in sub-Saharan Africa were making ends meet in 2018. And that's lower than in 2007, even though economic growth over that period should have raised incomes for, did raise national incomes quite significantly. Equally, there's also a decline in Latin America and the Caribbean, such that more than 40% of the population didn't feel that they were getting by in 2018. And when you think about this figure compared with the story we're told by extreme poverty data, it's obviously nothing to do with this. The extreme poverty has fallen from 35% in 1990 to 10% in 2015. So we'd expect many fewer people to be feeling poor across the world, and indeed a very small proportion. And yet what's happened is quite a high proportion of people feel poor still, and more people were feeling poor in 2018 than were in 2007, which I thought was very striking. And here's another thing I think to pay attention to, is people's expectations. So this graph just shows you, people were asked in 2014, how much on a ladder of 1 to 5, or 1 to 10, how much your life will improve in the next 5 years. And you see, so people in sub-Saharan Africa were very optimistic. They thought their life would be miles better 5 years from now. People in Latin America as well, they thought their lives would be better. And across the world, generally people had high expectations. The actual change, well, things improved a little bit in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, but really went downhill in Latin America. People thought their lives were less good 5 years on than they had been in 2014. So what does that do? It's not just about how you feel today. It's the mental frustration of being further behind than you were 5 years previously. And just a very quick look at governance. Here we have around 50% of the population are irritated, or 50% of the population or so in Latin America feel that corruption is pervasive in government. So that really does reduce your confidence that the government will fix these, play a role in improving livelihoods. So then we go, so we have the grievances, and now we move quickly to the structural factors. So here, inequalities, atomization, and polarization sort of capture it, but obviously these structural factors, I've said, they're everything. They're historical, they're social. You need a polymath approach to grasp it, and an infinity of time. But we generalize these as being related to deeper rooted systemic issues, the sort of default lines within society. And this is why discontent cannot be adequately addressed by matching policy to grievance. If pensions are low, we'll raise your pensions. It's not necessarily likely to work. And often the question is not whether a specific government delivers, but whether a system delivers. So it's not necessarily an administration that people have lost faith in, because an election might change that, but rather it's any hope that any government would be able to fix their problems. And also these systems are not just economic, they're also political and social. And they're not confined to the national level. In an increasingly interconnected world, there are many factors that can reinforce imbalances and bottlenecks at a national level. And when we understand the part of one of the things that emerged while we were examining this phenomenon is how it was quite striking, is that often discontent is concentrated amongst the middle classes and in middle income countries. So these are people who have achieved a certain, have advanced, have improved their living standards, perhaps they're among the people who are no longer considered poor. And they're in countries that have experienced a certain amount of growth. And then typically they've experienced some kind of impediment that has stopped them advancing further. And so to raise Hirschman again, he has this wonderful tunnel metaphor, which I probably don't have time to go in for now, but it's worth looking into, and I'm definitely yeah, perhaps in the Q&A. So structural factors. Well, here's a sort of a short list, just to give you some idea of the kind of issues we were looking at. So there's inequality, there's deterioration of interpersonal trust, loss of support networks, decline in civic engagement, rising stress levels and anomie, and these really kind of speak to an individual's kind of isolation and the fragmentation of society. And then you have the culture wars, political dysfunction, and new technologies which sort of reinforce the polarization. Yes, they fragment and they atomize, but it's also the polarization of opinion that is so dangerous in these times. And because we're talking about development, very quickly, these sort of structural weaknesses overlap with, as I said, what we call these development traps around low productivity, weak institutions, social vulnerability, and unsustainable environmental models, all of which make it extremely difficult to not only to address, not only to these sort of exacerbate fragmentation, because invariably there are people who are better off than those who aren't, and sort of closing the gap between them is extremely hard because of these bottlenecks. But they're a source of discontent. They sort of exacerbate they make it very difficult to achieve the reforms needed to sort of address the grievances. But these traps point to the importance of better quality growth. So the report points out that in some ways we've never had it so good, in that GDP grew around the world almost uninterruptedly for 30 years after 1990. So why has discontent risen over this period? Well, in the report we identify the usual suspects of rising inequality, uneven improvements in living standards. So yes, there have been improvements in some, but not necessarily others. And also living standards have followed the same kind of inequality. So for some part of the population, they have improved, but in others, for other sections, much so. And then a big one, which is the deterioration of working conditions, which has created, well, I mean, I'm a big fan of the concept of the precariat by Guy Standing. And I think it means different things in different places, of course. So when you're thinking about developing countries, perhaps it's less about people in insecure jobs in the gig economy and more about the working poor, people trapped in informality or child labor. But there is this sense that a small portion of the population has got very rich off the back of a large proportion of the workforce that is suffering from increasingly bad conditions. And it is worth noting that even prior to COVID, the number of people in child labor had risen for the first time, and indeed 10% of children globally were engaged in child labor, which is a terrible statistic. And then, of course, perhaps most urgently, we have the environmental catastrophe that's associated. The rise in emissions is so closely linked to GDP growth, and it's not just obviously about emissions; it's about biodiversity loss and a general kind of assault on natural systems. And so, I'm conscious of time, so I want to move quickly through these. A point about inequality here, though, I mean, as I mentioned previously, inequality is often cited as the foremost cause of discontent, and it's very, it's obviously there. But what I'd encourage us to do is better understand what form of inequality we're talking about. So, income inequality. Great for us to measure. Sorry, that point is slightly confusing. It's, we can, economists understand income inequality because you take your household survey and it's very neat. But for anyone in the real world, it's extremely difficult to understand income inequality because you don't know how much your neighbor earns. And often you have a very bad sense of how much you earn relative to the sort of population of a whole. And the Gini coefficient is not particularly intuitive. Moreover, income inequality isn't necessarily a source of discontent. People might just say, well, that person's got ahead because I live in a fair society, but and they work very hard, they had a great idea, whatever it might be. I'm happy with my income. It's always dangerous to assume that people won't themselves understand some kind of stratification. However, what research shows is that inequality of opportunity really does irritate people a great deal, and that's much more closely linked to discontent than income inequality. And inequality of opportunity is really another way of saying social mobility. And when we think of social mobility, it's a nice term because it conveys the broader implications of this, because there's always political and social factors behind people's capacity to move. And there's a real danger, and I think it's exacerbated polarization within societies to pretend that anything is a meritocracy. And so people who've got ahead assume that they got ahead because they are brilliant, and anyone who's left behind, well, they don't owe them anything because they're less brilliant and they didn't work as hard. So this sort of this notion of meritocracy it's important for people to believe in, but it's very dangerous if it's sort of is a false variety thereof. The other thing we wanted to draw attention to in the report is how much more relative deprivation is felt more strongly by groups than by individuals. So an individual who looks at his neighbor or his or her neighbor and thinks, well, they've got a nicer car and a nicer house, they'll more than likely blame themselves. However, if they see that their entire neighborhood or their entire city has fallen behind, and they see that there is a group to which they belong that is somehow disadvantaged, that's when this often turns to kind of social mobilization. And this collective inequality can be ethnic or geographical or gender-based, and often it's a combination of factors that make it extremely difficult to unpick. And the importance of relative deprivation doesn't necessarily it doesn't weaken it doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't worry about absolute deprivation, but studies of absolute deprivation generally suggest that even when food or fuel is suddenly very expensive and people are worried about how they'll get through the next day, there is more often than not some kind of sense of grievance or frustration at broader inequalities. And so just to give you a sense of structural factors, interpersonal trust extremely low in developing countries, and including in Africa and Latin America. So here you see barely 20% of people, and often much lower in Africa, believe that other people can generally be trusted. And in Latin America also, and there's been declines over this period, which is quite difficult to believe. But the general point is, of course, there's a terrible basis for social cohesion. It's a terrible basis for economic development, because so much trust is the lubricant of so much of what underpins the processes that underpin development. And so this, combined with the low trust in government, really points to an extremely weak social contract, not only in terms of the relationship between the state and society, but also relations between different parts of society. And I think that's one of the things we wanted to bring out. The social contract isn't just about what the state owes you or you owe the state, but also what people owe each other. We also see stress levels rising sharply, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So almost 50% of the global population, in many regions, close to 50% of people live with stress on a daily basis. And then we have the culture wars, which probably take us into an area which is extremely rich and extremely important. But I would say that the most important point here is that, as I mentioned earlier, these kind of this competition for recognition and power between different groups, and indeed dwindling resources in the COVID era, are generating culture wars that are based around different values and outlooks that can usually live side by side, but in the current context find it increasingly hard to live with each other. And this makes it extremely difficult to agree on even the most fundamental challenges we say. So COVID-19, whether it be mask wearing or vaccines, climate change, does this even exist? We're still having these conversations. Migration, these issues go so far beyond the sort of the facts in inverted commas and the science or whatever you would like to say. I mean, we can't address these through rationality alone. These culture wars in the end, so I'll just show you very quickly these huge disparities in acceptance of migrants around the world, and also satisfaction with efforts to preserve the environment, both in different regions, also with within different income groups in different regions. And then, there's this kind of political failure that we've remarked. Identity politics associated with the culture wars, but it's bigger than that. And it's, what we're seeing is a shift towards a politics that is what some call post-democracy. It's personality-driven. It's transactional. Often it's very much governed by which party appears better able to manage the economy, and no more than that. And there's been this traditional political identities of the left and the right. And there's also, it's not been helped by these technocratic approaches to government, which often lack a project for the future, and an uncertain future at that. And also assume that we have all the tools we need. So, there's people are unhappy. Well, we can fix that. We know what we as government have the technical solution to your problems, and more these technical solutions obviously don't work for everyone, and in many cases they don't work at all. But also at a more in a different way, we have the commitments to reduce inequality are undermined by political systems themselves, what we call a winner-takes-all politics, whereby economic and political inequality reinforce each other, for example, lobbying, or through the fact that politicians come from an elite class. All these different kind of factors are extremely damaging to the integrity of a democratic system, which is effectively meant to represent the interests of everyone. And what we see is emerging as a sort of a distance between political systems and the people, which is hastened by the demise of secondary institutions. So where people engage less, when they belong less to unions or go to churches or political parties, when these kind of institutions are weak, then there isn't an interlocutor for people. They don't have someone to sort of collate their voice, to aggregate their voice and make it heard politically. And so that we have this growing gulf between political systems and people that populist leaders have really been able to exploit, along with broader failings of governments in the last 20 or 30 years. And it's very easy when governments are unable to address inequality to say, I'm the voice of the people who have been left behind, because people have been left behind and no one is speaking to them yet, so why isn't this person? And now the truth is that the evidence suggests the populist leaders typically tend to completely lack a program that's capable of addressing the problems societies confront. And moreover, they tend to worsen polarization and weaken trust. So even if, as has often been the case, COVID has exposed their limitations, the damage these leaders can do is extensive. And finally, we have the impact of new technologies. And I think I should move through this as well, because I'm sure you all know pretty well these kind of stories around digital divides, the fragmentation of echo chambers, the dangers of misinformation and weakening trust. And indeed, the point perhaps to end on is that social media is emerged as a game changer for mobilization. You have had Twitter revolutions for the last decade, but it doesn't necessarily correlate with effective social movements, because what people have remarked is that there's a lack of infrastructure to these movements. Yes, you can mobilize people very quickly, but there isn't sort of depth to it that's going to sustain the effort and will reach out and extend and persuade people. And people who mobilize might move on quickly to something else. And it's worth bearing in mind that digital surveillance is a game changer for repression as well. So what next? Well, we argue, and this is the end, that it's impossible to build back better without fostering inclusion, cohesion, and consensus. And this is important not only for addressing discontent, but also for development, and also for confronting the challenges that lie ahead, particularly environmental. We make a strong case for development strategies as a starting place, and that provided that these are inclusive in vision and in formulation. So there are a lot of voices involved. And we also recognize the importance of social capital, by which we mean the trust and the networks and the tacit knowledge that exist within society, not necessarily in companies. We're not talking about economic capabilities, but we're talking about sort of the qualities that are intrinsic to any society and that can actually foster development. We also think that the decentralization of power and resources is key to fostering participation, and not only that, but also to delivering innovation. And that environmental protection has to stop being a trade-off. It has to stop being an either-or. So, the social implications of environmental policies are often pitched against each other, and it's obviously complete madness. Whereas the sort of the economic sphere is left on its own, not necessarily, So, very inarticulately, but it's obviously environmental protection is key, climate change is key, and we try and explore different approaches to making sure that it gets higher status in government thinking. And fundamentally, new ideas, new approaches, and new mindsets are needed. And that's why it's so good to have this opportunity to present here today. So thank you very much again for this opportunity, and I would more than welcome any questions, criticisms, and anything else you might throw at me. Thank you.